Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the necessary shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, a counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. My normal partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is traveling, but he will report back on his travels after Labor Day. But I'm pleased to have as our special guest and Shield of the Republic this week, Bill Kristol, the editor-at-large of the Bulwark and the founding editor-in-chief of the late Weekly Standard. Bill, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Thanks, Eric. Good to be with you. Good to be pinch hitting for Eliot, and it's good to see you.
Well, it's great to have you sort of as we kind of reach the end of the summer and heading into a very complicated and busy fall, particularly on matters affecting Ukraine. We will have a supplemental vote on additional funds for Ukraine. The United States has provided almost $40 billion worth of aid. The Biden administration is proposing an additional $24 billion in aid to Ukraine. And it'll be interesting to see how that supplemental goes. I mean, there were 70 Republicans who have voted to strike aid for Ukraine from the budget in the House of Representatives. There's been a lot of discussion about this, including during the recent debate in Milwaukee among Republican presidential candidates. So how do you see the fight for the supplemental going, Bill? I mean, it seems to me that this is going to be a bit of a Rorschach test for, where people stand on conservative internationalism as a foreign policy among Republicans. But it's a pretty dicey situation. I mean, putting aside the question of whether we'll actually, have a government shutdown or a budget or a continuing resolution, all of which would be problematic, just on the Ukraine side.
I mean, as with all things congressional or many things congressional, it gets complicated because there will be some up or down votes on aid to Ukraine, either to strike it from a supplemental or from an overall CR, continuing resolution, which probably is how they end up passing on September 30th. That gets complicated because there are a million other issues in that CR that Republicans will or won't like, Biden spending and abortion provisions, you can imagine. And the government could get shut down on any of those, and the Ukraine aid is kind of sitting out there. It could go separately on a supplemental, but could also be wrapped up in one thing. So I guess I would step back a little from the minutiae of the congressional stuff, which I don't have a great handle on, and say this. And I'm very much of two minds. On the one hand, all things, if you had told me Trump runs on America first, Trump is president for 4 years, Trump is generally isolationist and doesn't care about enemies and generally pro-Putin.
And hostile to Ukraine.
And is impeached over his behavior on Ukraine, not convicted. And then January 6th happens, but Trump amazingly and terribly remains the leader of the Republican Party, and now is way ahead in the congressional, in the primary ballots, balloting, and like the likely nominee. In a certain way, the party is better from my point of view, and I think yours, on Ukraine than one might have expected. One might have just expected, okay, I guess the whole party is going to be, America first, by at this point. And in fact, either the kind of old-fashioned strength of the Mitch McConnell, Mike McCall wing of the party, the McCain, Romney, Bush wing, turns out there are people who still believe that, or the drama of Ukraine, if I can put it that way, the kind of amazing character of what Putin has tried to do and has done, the brutality of it, the uncomplicated good and evil question, frankly, all of that has cut the other way. And so I think we're in a very fluid situation. I was thinking about this before getting on the air here or getting on the audio here with you. And for most of our adult lives, the foreign policy lines were pretty well drawn, and there were divisions between the parties, of course. There were divisions within the parties, no question, but they were fairly predictable. I mean, from year to year, you said there was a wing of the Democrats that was McGovernite, there was a wing of the Democrats that was Scoop Jacksonite, and there was an in-between group. And on the Republican side, there were a few people, and this was especially maybe more true in the 90s and 2000s, who were kind of hard-headed, national interests. We shouldn't get involved in the Balkans, and then people like us who thought we should. But it was not. It didn't change that much year to year. You might say it wasn't that volatile. The balance of power was kind of fairly constant between these different wings. I do feel like now, in the last 7 years, have been so unprecedented with Trump that it's really hard to know where the momentum is. I mean, clearly on Ukraine, there was such a rallying to Ukraine after February 24th of last year that there was huge support, even among Republican members. That's faded some, no question, partly just war weariness, partly because the natural weight of the Trump wing of the party, so to speak, has just worn down some of the people who have started off in a good place. On the other hand, the polls still show the Republican electorate is kind of 50-50-ish, really. Republican House Conference is kind of 50-50-ish. Republican senators better. And so I guess I'm mildly optimistic that after all the zigs and zags happen in September, the aid will be there for Ukraine. Then there'll be another vote probably in December if they go to an omnibus from the CR, if the CR only lasts for 2 or 3 months. I still think we'll be okay, but it's worrisome. I think it's highly dependent on events, and progress in Ukraine will help, obviously, in the sense that it's not an endless war. Somewhat contingent on the presidential race, which on the one hand has been bad in the sense that Trump, DeSantis, and Ramaswamy, DeSantis being less bad than those other two, but not great, have 75% of the Republican electorate at this point, and the ones who were good in the debate the other night, Christie, Haley, and Pence have 15%. So it's in a way, given that it's that lopsided, things on the Hill are better than one might have expected, don't you think?
I think that's fair. And the public opinion element of this is worth sort of pausing on for a second, which is, I think public opinion overall, considering that we're 18 months into this now almost, has been relatively robust. And, just anecdotally, I know that when I drive down to our place, on the Eastern Shore, as you drive down, and a lot of that's Trump country, right? It's rural Maryland and, rural, Eastern Shore, Virginia. You see a lot of Ukrainian flags hanging from doorways, which, frankly, when I first saw them, kind of gobsmacked me. I was like, are you kidding? I mean, where did they even get these things? It's been relatively robust and pretty at the top line steady. But as you say, the kind of worrisome, kind of troubling part has been pretty clear decline over time among Republicans to support. As you say, it's kind of split now, kind of nobody has a majority. It's really kind of split pluralities, 48-48, something like that, or low 40s maybe on each side, and 10% who don't know. But it has declined, and that is a bit worrisome because it looks like it could be normalizing a bit around the Trump Ramaswamy sort of side of things. Now, you and our publisher, Sarah Longwell, have started an effort to bolster support for Ukraine in the public with Republicans for Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What prompted you, and how's it going, and what are your plans?
Happy to. I would just add to what you were saying, though. It's so interesting because on the one hand, when one looks at it in a sort of level of congressional votes, and we've got to hang on, we've got to get them another 24 billion at the level of. You've spoken about this eloquently. We've done conversations on it and written about it for the Bulwark, and others have too. I mean, on the other hand, this is a huge moment in a way. I mean, and the whole Putin's invasion and what's happening in Ukraine could be a defining moment for the 21st century. I think when you go to Europe, they feel that way, and they have certainly changed a lot. And we've all argued, is it really a Zeitenwende in Germany or not? But I mean, it's big, I think, and it's big here. And incidentally, the Democratic Party, which no one talks about, has in fact changed, I think, a fair amount, partly because of Ukraine. I mean, if you had told us that they would be, we have our quarrels with what they've done, and they haven't been as they've been a little more cautious than we would recommend and so forth. But on this and other things, and tried as well, even defense spending, where again, they're not quite where we are. this is not the McGovern Democrats, it doesn't feel like it. So I think a lot is going on. There's a lot of moving parts. Europe is a moving part. The Democratic Party is a moving part. The Republican Party is a moving part. For now, in the short term, the key for me, and this is why Sarah and I did this, is we got to keep Republican support so the Ukrainians have a chance to win. I mean, that's really crucial. And then we can all have long discussions in a year about, how to build on that victory and how to form new alliances for the 21st century and so forth. And so we've started an effort, Republicans for Ukraine. We did an ad that was shown during the debate. We've done the usual medley of digital stuff and billboards and other ads on television stations in some key areas. But we've done it in the way that Sarah has done the other efforts that the Republican Accountability Project and Defending Democracy Together have done, which is Republican voters speaking to their cell phones and saying, "Hey, I'm a Republican and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, or something, and we got to support Ukraine." And we tested this way back in 2018-19, and really discovered that having regular people saying what they truly believe, and these are real people, and you get their names, and they're putting themselves on the line because some of their neighbors won't agree with them and so forth, and saying either I can't vote again for Trump for a second term, or saying we need to uphold the rule of law, or in this case saying we need to stand with Ukraine, seems to have an effect. Now, we don't have enough money to change, you have to spend tens of millions of dollars, if not more, to change public sentiment appreciably, but you can bolster public sentiment when it's uncertain. You can bolster members of Congress. They go home and there's an ad in their district and someone from their district or their state is saying this. It makes them feel less lopsided. I mean, the one thing that happens is the people who go to the town halls are the Trump supporters. They are the America Firsters. They're not the, people who are kind of traditional Republicans and think, yeah, we have to do the right thing here or there, less so. This bolsters that side of the equation. So we're going to continue this effort. It'll be the usual mix of paid media and earned media and so forth. We're going to focus on some key players here in September who seem to be sort of, swing players, you might say, on this issue, and with advertising, with persuasion of other kinds. We're working with other groups, many of whom you know too, and other individuals, to do stuff privately behind the scenes as well. Let's make sure that people these Republican members of Congress respect are going up and briefing them and talking to them, and so they can't just say, "Oh, this is the Biden administration," or "This is a few never Trumpers." But in fact, there are plenty of people who served in the Trump administration, and plenty of people who voted twice for Trump, who believe you have to stick with Ukraine. And so, getting those people in front of these Republican members, we're helping others do that behind the scenes. So, I think it's very important. It's, as I say, this isn't Republicans for Ukraine is not the place where we're going to have the full bore discussion of what the deep significance of this war is for the next 20 years or the last 20 years and all the lessons that have to be learned. But I am struck, but I will say this, since we've had our young guys there and young men and women at Defending Democracy Together helping with all these videos, and this takes a lot of time to recruit these people, get them comfortable with doing it, helping them a little bit if they need some technical assistance. It's not very hard. Getting their approval for the ad once it's done. These people are very sincere and it's very impressive how many people, that's sort of like as you were saying, driving down to your place there. I mean, it's these are not professional foreign policy people. These are not people necessarily who served in NATO in 2017 and training Ukrainian troops. That's great too, and there are a couple like that. But mostly these are people who just are looking at this situation with Putin and Russia and Ukraine and saying, we cannot let this stand. We cannot live in a world in which he gets away with the invasion, and in which he gets away with the brutality, and in which we bug out of the largest war in Europe in 80 years and let the brutal, aggressive dictator win. I mean, that common sense attitude, which you could argue is a Cold War attitude and now a post-Cold War attitude, I think I've been sort of heartened that it's out there, and it's pretty strong among regular voters of both parties here in the U.S., even though it's a long way away. It's not like you and I discussed this, it's like if you go to Central Europe, I mean, Ukraine is right there, Ukrainians are right there, but it's in people's minds that they do not want to live in a world in which, and they understand the implications for China and the implications for other dictators and other aggressors. So I've been somewhat heartened as we put this project together.
Yeah, and I mean, I found the ads, actually in many cases really quite moving, and a great, from my point of view, antidote to some of the effort on the other side, I was thinking of Heritage, which has been putting money into ads saying, well, Biden wants to send more money to Ukraine instead of sending it to Hawaii to deal with the wildfires, which, the kind of we need to do nation building at home kind of stuff that you would have anticipated not coming from, the center right, a few years ago, but from the, McGovernite left, as you were saying. So at a minimum, I think it does that. Who do you see as the key players on the Republican side? I mean, you mentioned McConnell, and Jonathan Martin had a big piece on McConnell in Politico about how Senator McConnell sees it as sort of his, defining kind of maybe legacy effort, as he is moving on in years to try and preserve conservative internationalism in the Republican Party, and he's trying to bring along a group of younger Republican senators, many of whom he took with him on, to Munich and then beyond in Codell's. But what other voices do you think are crucial? Obviously, you had the pretty impassioned comments by Nikki Haley during the debate, which I thought were great. And you had Pence and Chris Christie, both of whom have gone to Kyiv, met with President Zelensky. But who are the other key voices, and what voices would you like to see coming out there?
I mean, so to begin with the debate, since you mentioned it, yeah, I think I was struck in the debate. On the one hand, you could say, as I said earlier, that 75% of the voters seem to be with the non-pro-Ukraine candidates, and I think that's true. Of course, Trump wasn't at the debate, so we didn't see him have to defend his position. But I thought the exchange between basically Ramaswamy, DeSantis pretty much stayed out of it, Ramaswamy on the one hand, and I guess all three of them, right, Pence, Haley, and Christie on the other, was good. I mean, that is to say, even if you aren't for Christie, Pence, and Haley, and most Republican voters at this point aren't, you had to sort of realize these were pretty serious people making pretty serious arguments. This was not the normal, I'm positioning myself a little bit on one side or the other. And it wasn't, and they made it in a way that was neutral on Trump, you might say. It wasn't sort of, we need to repudiate Trump and Putin and therefore support Ukraine. It was just, look, this is a foreign policy challenge, a big one. And so a couple of them, as you say, have been there, and others, I think Haley knows a fair amount about it. She was UN ambassador. And they were pretty, I thought, strong in making the case why it's both the right thing to do and in our national interest. So I think a debate may have had a marginally good effect, actually, on the dynamic. So that's on the one hand. On the Hill, Senator McConnell has been excellent, and I think has done a very good job of keeping Senate Republicans solidly for it. I assume they'll get a pretty good vote in the Senate for Ukraine aid as part of the package, maybe as part of a CR that would begin in the Senate. It's going to be complicated because there'll be people who want to vote against the CR in final passage because they won't like the domestic spending, or they won't like this, or they want to defund, God knows, the special counsel or something. But it's very important if there's a clean vote on Ukraine aid, which there could be, right, to strike the Ukraine aid, let's say, from the back. Very important for McConnell, I think, to be able to show, 35 Republican senators standing with Ukraine. I think it will have some effect over in the House. So I think the Senate's worth focusing on. McConnell knows what he's doing and probably doesn't need much help from us, but if we were in touch with them, and if it turns out some senators could use some reinforcement in their states, that would be fine. In the House, it's a little more complicated. The relevant committee chairs are good. So a lot of the Freedom Caucus and most aggressive Trumpy types are bad. McCarthy has been straddling. Everyone assumes he wants to keep it going, but doesn't want to endanger his own political future or cause a huge rift in the conference on it if possible. That's going to be very tricky for him to manage. I think he's very important, and I think it's very important, honestly, if there are major Republican donors or influencers listening to this, they need to. McCarthy is very important to say to him, look, you do what you want, make all the accommodations with Trump that maybe people like me don't like at all. A vote on domestic policy, whatever you want, start an investigation of Hunter Biden or the 15th investigation of Hunter Biden. But you cannot, this is serious. I mean, you cannot sell out Ukraine because you got a bunch of yahoos in your conference who don't know a thing about it and don't care about it, honestly. They just want to defeat Biden on every front. They're not, I mean, I feel bad almost when we call them McGovernites. McGovern had a view of the world and of foreign policy, which he cared about. It wasn't what we agreed with. These people don't have a view of anything except, that Biden's doing it, so we're against it. And plus, it's an easy thing. It's a demagogue. think McCarthy's very important. I think Stefanik is very important. She's been a huge disappointment the last 7 years, really. Well, 5 years, I guess, certainly since 2018. Totally gone in the tank for Trump in a pretty bad way, I've got to say. But she's been pretty good on Ukraine, and I think she does she worked with us years ago on some foreign policy stuff, and maybe some of that she still believes it, or whatever reason. So I don't think she hasn't stuck her neck out that way, but I think it would be damaging if she went in a Trumpy direction and started to really come out against the aid package. So I think keeping Stefanik kind of at least neutral and not leading the opposition is important practically. And then there are other members who were influential in different, obviously among different parts of the conference and different regions and so forth. But I don't think this is one where, I think this is one where if McCarthy, Scalise, and Stefanik want it to happen, they may not stick their necks out. They may give people a lot of votes to make them feel better and make them look better, or where they don't approve of this, and we need to have much more auditing of the aid here, and we have to do this and time. But I think basically, if they want it to happen, I think it will happen.
One of the things that's struck me about this has been the voices that are absent, and what I think represents a real sad set of changes in the Republican Party. One, of course, is John McCain, and we're right around the anniversary of his passing, 5 years ago. I think you can really see how much this debate misses his voice. There are other voices, though, that that are missing. Ben Sass, for instance, at one time you could have counted on to, make this case. Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, and so a lot of those voices are just not there. And you get the sense that Mitt Romney is maybe thinking about not running again. He's certainly not out there banging a drum to raise a lot of money. He's going to have a primary. I can, at his age, imagine him, and I wouldn't, at all begrudge it to him. Say at my, age and station in life, I don't really need this anymore, But it does worry you that a lot of voices that one would hope would be in this debate are just, for a variety of reasons, now not there anymore. One thing you hear from some of McConnell's people, I'm really interested in your view of this, is that they really would like Biden to really make the case publicly for aid to Ukraine in a way that he hasn't done. I mean, he's made comments, to reporters at Gaggles coming on or off Air Force One, or, when he's on a bicycle ride in Delaware. But there's been no kind of concerted speech to the nation about what you were saying earlier. This is a really important point in time. To some degree, the future character of international relations can be set by how this conflict comes out. Here's why we have to do it, and we can't be partisan about it. I know we've got Republicans and Democrats who both want to do this, and Republicans and Democrats who are opposed to it. So it's not a partisan issue. You could, I think, imagine that it could be a very powerful speech if he gave it. On the other hand, I've had some people argue to me, well, things are so polarized that if he makes his speech, it'll just drive, some Republicans crazy and maybe get them not to vote for it. Where do you come down? I mean, my view is just fundamental presidential leadership. He needs to make that speech.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to be where you are, and I do think at some point we, pay a price for not having that speech or set of speeches made or by him or by other very senior people, or op-eds written jointly by former presidents, Bush and Obama and whatever. And the rationale against whether it's the Bush-Obama type thing or against the Biden speeches is in the case of the Biden speeches, we're so polarized that it's better, honestly, if we can just get this through with bipartisan votes without making it Biden's war, but it's America's war, or America's effort to help Ukraine instead of Biden's effort to help Ukraine. And that's good. And I take that point. I mean, that's just, if it's better to make it America's effort, and if having Biden be way out front is a problem, fine. But then other people need to step up and make the case. And I think some of us have tried. So I think that's a reasonable point of view. But then I do think there needs to be someone making the case. And that gets to the other set of people, which would be your former secretaries of state, former presidents, or current ones, or recent ones, or people who don't agree on anything. The aforementioned Mike Pompeo, along with, I don't know, one of President Obama's secretaries of state or so forth. Not Hillary Clinton, that would be a bridge too far, but, and or national security advisors and so forth. And that there hasn't really been. And I don't think that probably doesn't happen spontaneously. Unless the administration does it behind the scenes. And I remember the Cold War days, and even when I was in the White House there and with Quayle in 89 to 93, we did stuff with Democrats that didn't have George H.W. Bush's or Dan Quayle's name on it, obviously. There was a joint op-ed by, I don't know, then Representative Les Aspin, and there were Steve Solars for the Democrats, or then Congressman, whoever the kind of equivalent respectable Republicans were, I can't remember anymore, for the Republicans. But we helped them do it, and we helped provide information, and we helped, push for it and so forth. These things tend to happen with executive branch energy behind them. And I don't know, maybe the Biden administration is doing this incidentally. I really assume they're doing some of it. But I generally feel there's been a slight failure of, a sense that they need to keep the country really on board on this and not just assume that Putin's doing their work for them. Putin is doing a fair amount of their work for them, to be honest. I mean, Putin has been such a cartoon villain. It's not a cartoon if you live in Ukraine, obviously, or in Russia itself. And, in a way, it's made it easier than it used to be to maybe rally people. But again, there does need to be a little more of an articulation. And certainly going into to 2024, and certainly it's Donald Trump's the Republican nominee, because he's going to make the case the other way. And it wouldn't hurt for Biden to kind of lay the groundwork to make that harder for Trump to do 6 months from now.
Do you think it's something maybe that President Bush and President Clinton might be able to do jointly? I mean, they've done a whole bunch of stuff on disaster relief, around the world at different times. But what about something as fundamental as this? I mean, it seems to me if the two of them would make some appearances, supporting this, it might have a positive effect.
Yeah, I think so. Now, I think among Republicans, maybe, just George W. Bush being a nice guy with Clinton again and stuff, maybe there it's better to have more of a, recent Republican secretaries to say maybe that is more of a McMaster, Pompeo, John Bolton, Mark Esper.
Right, yeah, Esper's been very good.
Yeah, if the real Trumpists have problems with all those people because they didn't go along with January 6th, they didn't go along with the worst excesses of Trump, but nonetheless, they have some personal connection with people on the Hill and credibility, and they did serve with Trump and so forth. They're not, associated with the Bush administration and the war in Iraq and all those terrible things. So or not as much. So I think, I'd be for any mix, any versions. There are many ways to mix and match these different leaders, but I do think having more of that happen. I think McConnell's tried to do some, and maybe he can make some stuff happen here in September. But having people who are not, having just the case being made. I also think, you and I talked about this, not on this podcast, but in other places. I was very struck when I was in Europe, when was that? So that was in the late spring, early summer. With Jeff Gedman, they're very good people in Europe who really are terrific leaders. A lot of them young, a lot of them from the Nordic countries. Those people very well in the Balts. The new Czech president, who's not quite as young, but who's very impressive. Just won an election, defeated a kind of Trumpy-like incumbent, and he's center-right. Some of the others are more center-left. I don't think the administration's done a very good job of bringing them over and highlighting them and taking a bit of the steam out of the typical Republican talking point of, the Europeans aren't doing anything. Hey, it's not really quite true this time. There's some legitimate complaints about the Europeans, but it's not true. And again, people just have the sense that Europe is Germany and France, and we do have legitimate beefs to some degree with those two, I suppose, more France maybe. But in general, I don't think the Biden administration has done particularly well. They haven't been terrible, but they just haven't done particularly well in sort of thinking of the public diplomacy side of this whole effort here at home, and how, again, Europe could not just be a sort of burden that they have to kind of defend, or say it's good that the alliance is strong, but to really make a big deal. Sweden and Finland, an infinite amount about this, having been ambassador to Finland, are in NATO, and that's an achievement, and it's a testimony to them, and it's a testimony, sadly, to Putin, but a testimony to Ukraine to fight so well. Zelensky has done a lot of the good public diplomacy on this personally, but I just feel there's a lot more they could do to make clear to some of those voters. I mean, the American public, to its credit, has sort of gotten this anyway so far. These Republican voters for Ukraine have kind of gotten it so far, but there's probably more that could be done to make clear how big a deal this is and how important it is for the U.S. to stand firm.
I agree. And your comments, Bill, I think highlight the degree to which I think the administration, in some ways, has seemed to underplay and underestimate the information space in which this conflict is playing out. Last week there was this whole spate. End of last weekend and the middle of last week, there was this whole spate of stories that appeared in the Financial Times, New York Times, the Washington Post, which basically highlighted disagreements that the U.S. Department of Defense has had with Ukrainian strategy, and the counteroffensive isn't moving fast enough, and they're not making enough use of the equipment, and they're using too much artillery, and this and that and the other thing. And Frank Miller and I published a piece on Friday in the Bulwark, and yesterday Jack Keane, our friend, had a piece in a similar vein, basically saying, look, none of these military critics in the United States has ever had to fight the kind of fight that the Ukrainians are in. Some of the things that people have been advocating are just silly. I mean, David Ignatius had a column the other day in which he was quoting someone as saying, well, the Ukrainians are putting too much effort into using UAVs for reconnaissance. They ought to have dismounted people doing reconnaissance. I think some of those people ought to volunteer and go over to be part of those human terrain reconnaissance teams, walking into some of the most heavily landmined, territory in the world. It's just this kind of, armchair quarterbacking that, not only is it sort of offensive, I think, to the Ukrainians. You could see some very acerbic responses from various Ukrainians. But it seems to me that the whole thing was undercutting their own case for the supplemental on the Hill and with the public at large. It was making it seem like the Ukrainians are just, headed towards a stalemate. It's going to be an endless war. I mean, we may be headed towards a stalemate, but why would you be saying that at this point when it's still relatively early, in the conflict? And any number of people have made the analogy to how long it took us to break out of Normandy after the D-Day invasion. These are, tough fights. As Chairman Milley has said, this is going to be a tough fight, but they seem to be kind of oblivious to the information side of this, both here at home and, internationally. I mean, Jake Sullivan ultimately had to come out and say, no, we don't think it's, a stalemate right now, et cetera. But am I the only one who thinks they're a little bit clueless in Gaza when it comes to the information space?
No, I think that you're right. And what's particularly annoying, obviously, is when there are administration officials quoted on background saying this stuff. Obviously, they can't control what think tanks say and so forth, and others, and so some of that's inevitable, obviously. But also, even if some character from some think tank says something, they can push back. Now they can sometimes get others outside government to push back and rebut some pieces. But in general, one has the impression they think, look, the war is the war. They're working very hard on it. They're making decisions. Not all of them. I think they could do a little more in a couple of areas, but they don't. I don't know. I mean, this is an honest question. I really don't know who's in charge of the public diplomacy side of this. I mean, is there an actual human being at the NSC or state who gets up every morning and says, okay, what arguments are unfortunately making a little too much headway out there in social media or in op-ed pages or in Europe for that matter, that we need to beat back? And who can we beat back? And if it's not, Jake Sullivan giving a talk, it can be, getting 10 people into the White House to brief them and give them a good, high quality, unclassified briefing on what's happening in the war, and then making sure they, helping them get the case out. In general, I just feel like there's been a little less of that. I mean, I'm closer to the Biden administration than I was to the Obama administration. I'm really not making this, God knows what me, and I don't, need an invitation anywhere. But when I supported President Obama's Afghan surge, I guess it was, or maybe it was Libya intervention. It was I think it was Libya, maybe not the one that stood up the best, but whatever. In 2011, at the height of the Arab Spring, they had about 15 of us into the White House, and we were people who've been very critical of President Obama and strong McCain supporters and people associated with the Iraq War, which President Obama wasn't a big fan of. So it was a little bit, fraught, you might say, at the meeting in the reservoir room. But they said, look, we're in this, you guys are supporting, we're on the same page mostly on this, and we need to hear the arguments. And if you need any information, here's the right person to email at the NSC. And it was all totally stuff that you and I have done a million times. It goes what government does and what the other side does too. In fact, they call them their friendly people and so forth. But it's just funny that's been more, I felt like there was more of that there. And certainly more of in the Clinton administration, even as Clinton was getting impeached, Sandy Berger was having people in and we were agreeing that we had to, help in the Balkans and support the effort in Kosovo and so forth. And look, I'm happy to say it regardless of whether I'm in the White House, obviously, and you are too, but I do feel like there's been a little bit of a ball being dropped here in terms of doing that. And also then across the Atlantic. I mean, there's could be everyone I talked to in Europe, they're grateful for what the Biden administration's done. They're supportive. They're doing their own thing there. They don't need to be told what to say. They know in the Czech Republic or in Finland or in Lithuania what the arguments are, believe me. But I don't get the impression they're in close contact, especially, or that they're coordinating the arguments, especially when there's a NATO summit. Then there's kind of a moment of 2 weeks of frantic activity to make sure everyone's more or less on the same page. But so I do think on the diplomacy side, they could do more. I mean, I think to be fair, the Biden administration's allies in other policy areas would say the same thing. He's got pretty good economic performance here after a pandemic and everything else. Inflation's coming down, and like, who's making that case? I mean, they prevented a pretty serious banking crisis pretty effectively, I've got to say, is my sense. And I've talked to a couple of economists who say this. And, I don't know, does anyone give Biden administration, Janet Yellen, credit for the fact that it looked like we might have a major bank run and we haven't? And in fact, the situation is pretty stable and no one even remembers quite what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and First National. It's an administration that's not very good at the making its own case side of things. And they've kind of gotten away with it on Ukraine so far, as I say, because Zelensky's so admirable and the Ukrainians are so admirable and Putin's so horrible. But I think we need a little more effort here in the next couple of months and then in the next year.
You mentioned the Europeans. One of the things that, I hear from European colleagues, and it's begun to pop up a bit in the U.S. press as well, is their concern about what's going on and the things we've been talking about, the Republican debate, the potential for Trump to be the nominee again, and, the non-trivial possibility that he could actually, win the election in 24. And then, what happens to Ukraine policy, then. It's interesting in that context that you now just in the last few days, have started to see reports about Europeans looking to try and make long-term commitments to the Ukrainians and get a lot, kind of center of gravity inside NATO among European countries to make long-term commitments to Ukraine so that Putin can't just count on, playing, running things out until the U.S. election in the hope that Trump, wins and then, sort of saves him from the kind of, morass he's gotten himself into.
I mean, the degree to which, just on that, I know we have to go in a minute. I mean, the degree to which Putin's strategy is hang on until Trump might win is understated. And we all probably need to say that more often. This is not like it's not like Putin's fighting a war. And one of the 15 things that could happen, this one would be something good for him, would be that Trump might win in 2020, get nominated first and then win in 2024. That's like the number one thing that would be good for him. And it's the number one thing he's counting on. And I think he's going to desperately hang on until it's clear that Trump won't win or hasn't won in November 24. That's his best way out of this. And incidentally, what it says about the possibility, I was talking with someone yesterday who was very involved in some of the stuff in 2016 on Russian disinformation. When this much is at stake for Putin, I mean, it could make 2016 look like nothing in terms of Russian disinformation and Russian meddling in the election. And, because his own regime, maybe his own rule may be at stake almost on our election. So what does he do? We've seen what he does with domestic opponents and in Europe and elsewhere. We saw what he did in 2016. I mean, this is much more existential crisis for Putin. So, but again, I think focusing a little more people's attention on the fact that it's not just Trump 2024 is sort of an accidental sidebar story. It's really crucial in terms of the actual fate of Ukraine and certainly in terms of Putin's strategy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Now, of course, the one of the major instruments Putin used to interfere in the 2016 election was the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, several of whose employees were indicted by Bob Mueller as a result of the Mueller investigation. That property seems to be like, up for grabs now among the various retainers around Putin, with the death this past week of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Not clear whether that instrument will be used or whether there'll be others, but he's got others like the GRU that he can use as well. So he's got a bunch of arrows in his quiver to interfere in our election, and I'm sure he will be doing that. I mean, CNN had a story recently about how the Russians are trying to infiltrate Russian talking points into Western, what used to be called useful idiots. I think actually Mona Charen wrote an excellent book some years ago about that. It needs to be. I've joked with Mona that it needs to be updated. I've also said that I thought Vivek Ramaswamy is actually a new category, which is useless idiot, but that's another story. I've been very critical of the Biden administration, as has Eliot on this podcast, for being very slow to get certain systems to the Ukrainians, for being dragged in the wake of the Europeans on multiple occasions for getting things to them. I do want to say I got the sense from talking to some people inside the Biden administration in the last week, they may be very close to making a positive decision to give the Ukrainians the M26 rocket-launched cluster munition, which would be launched from HIMARS, which would extend the range of the cluster munitions, which the ones that they've already gotten have had a huge effect on the battlefield already in helping the Ukrainians push through Russian defenses. Some of that has been visible in the area around Robotynya, where the Ukrainians have made a bit of a minor breakthrough through the first line of defense in recent days. Attackums, I think, which is the next big thing, is still, sort of up in the air. I mean, I'm sort of reminded, I wonder if you agree, Bill, of Churchill's comment, the Biden administration is like his description of the United States of America. It sort of ultimately does the right thing after systematically eliminating every other option.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's well said by Churchill and well applied by you. I mean, a little unfair maybe, but I think certainly some of these weapon systems they just didn't do, and now they're doing, and there was no price. It turns out there was no reason not to have done it 3 or 6 and 9 months before, and a lot of unfortunately lives were lost and time was squandered in not being able to do things. It does seem like now, with the seeming beginnings of breakthrough in a couple of places in the lines, which certainly be the time to get both the cluster munitions that can be launched at a greater distance that you were describing, and then the Attackums, which everyone says would be very important for this offensive as well. And I mean, they really need to go for it here. I mean, they've all the arguments about Putin, red lines and stuff seem not to be true, and I just can't see that we have a lot of this stuff sitting around. Some of the stuff we should have resupplied much. We should have built much more of over the last year and gotten our defense industrial base going again, as you've made this argument repeatedly. But in the particular things, if I'm not mistaken, that we're talking about, we have a lot of it. And the big joke, you've made this comment, I think others have, Fred Kagan and many others. I mean, what's kind of crazy about the reluctance to do it is, why do we get all these weapons? We got all those weapons because in the unlikely event, but possible event, that there'd be a huge ground war in Europe. That's what these weapons are for. They're not really very useful, most of them in the Middle East, I don't think. And they're not, well, and in Asia, I don't think we're going to be fighting a ground war with HIMARSs, I mean, maybe we will, but it doesn't sound like that's terribly likely. So these are for the unlikely event of fighting a big land war in Europe. We're fighting the largest land war in Europe in 80 years. They're fighting it.
Yeah.
Thank God we're not. The Ukrainians are fighting it. What
Exactly.
are we saving these for?
No, absolutely.
I mean, we're going to have them in some garage, in some hangar.
Well, they're going to sell 40 Attackums. They're going to sell 40 Attackums to Morocco. So
yeah,
there you go. I mean, no, it's crazy. And it gives away one of the best talking points that they have to push back on this America first, send the money to Hawaii, et cetera, instead of Ukraine, for essentially 3%. And this is something Lindsey Graham actually said after coming out of Ukraine recently, for 3% of the defense budget of the United States, which what we've spent so far on this effort, we've destroyed 50% of Russia's combat power, according to the British Chief of Defense testifying in front of the House of Commons Defense Committee. That's the greatest bargain, since Lend-Lease.
Yeah, no, I know. And yeah, and also if people say, well, we're wasting all this money on defense, they buy all these weapons you never use. Obviously, it's not a reason to use them. That people are to prove that you're, need to have a high defense budget. But this is the moment. This is exactly what these weapons are designed for. This kind of land conflict. Hopefully, it's not going to happen too many times. In our lifetime or even after our lifetime. These things. Thank God, these wars don't happen every 3 years at this scale. Now it's happening at scale, and I think this is where the Biden administration, they sort of understand. I mean, of course, they kind of understand that they're not fools, and they're doing a lot of good things, and they're coming to grips with it. But I just feel they haven't quite internalized sort of that this is not like your typical, we do this here, move this chess piece over here, we got to be a little careful. But this is really at a different level and requires almost a different kind of thinking than the normal diplomatic and political military efforts that we've all engaged in government and that they're engaging in and which are good. But this is a little different.
I agree. As Eliot has said, they think they can titrate out this stuff and calibrate this. And, I just don't think, war operates on that kind of a timetable. Our guest today has been Bill Kristol. Bill, thank you for joining us on Shield of the Republic. It's been great having you. Best of luck to you and Sarah in the efforts for Republicans for Ukraine. I encourage our listeners to think about doing one of the ads for you all. I think that would be a great contribution to this debate. And we'll have to have you back in a couple of months to take the temperature and see how we're doing after the Reagan library debate. We'll see how much of the spirit of Ronald Reagan is still alive in the contemporary GOP.
Well, let's hope it's alive, and let's hope that after that's September 27th, and then September 30th would be the usual time the CR would get passed. So let's hope that we're in a cheerful mood and we can do it again in October or November. Thanks, Eric. It's been great as always talking with you.